Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us in this webinar, Open Pedagogy in Practice, Faculty Perspectives. My name is Lindsay Gum, and I am the Fellow for Open Education with the New England Board of Higher Education. We have some fantastic faculty panelists here with us today. But before we begin, I just want to take care of some housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be recorded, and about a week after today, we will send out a follow-up with a link to the recording and also a list of any of the questions that were asked in today's panel, along with the accompanying answers. And also, if any resources were brought up by our faculty panelists today, we will try our best to include those in them as well. And finally, any of the link to the recording, the presentation, the slides will be openly licensed and available at nebi.org/openeducation. If you are tweeting, you can feel free to tag us at Nebi. And finally, we will be opening up the question and answer session towards the end, but feel free to pop anything into the question and answer box. And our panelists and myself will be answering questions in chat, but also we'll select a few questions to ask live. Okay, I'm going to quickly hand it over to my colleague at Nebi, Rachel Stakoviak. She's going to tell you a little bit about Nebi if you're not familiar with regional compacts. So thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Lindsay, and thanks everyone joining us today. We're so pleased to have such a great panel and offer this presentation. As Lindsay said, before we get started, I'll just quickly introduce you to the New England Board of Higher Education. We call ourselves Nebi. For those who aren't familiar with us, we are located in Boston, Massachusetts. We're an organization who was founded in 1955 by the 6 visionary New England governors who sought to increase access to educational opportunities as a means to support the economic viability of the region. And as you know, our mission remains critical to the region today. Our organization regularly convenes top leaders and decision makers from P-12 and higher education, industry, government, and the nonprofit sector to bring together and host the critical cross-sector conversations that lead to change, collaboration, alignment, and innovation. You'll likely know us from some of our programs delivered across the region. We have the Regional Student Program, a tuition reciprocity program with the public institutions. We have a new program called the New England Independent College Transfer Guarantee, in addition to our upskilling and credentialing initiatives. All of these programs which aim to increase post-secondary education opportunities and build collaborative multi-state projects. And we're thrilled to bring this work to the region, this new open education portfolio that's supported by the Hewlett Foundation.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And like I said, we have a great group of panelists today, and I'm going to ask them to just briefly introduce themselves. So Robin, would you mind starting us off?
Sure. My name is Robin DeRosa, and I'm the director of the Open Learning and Teaching Collaborative at Plymouth State University in New Hampshire. I was previously an English professor and a director of an interdisciplinary studies program before I took over the Teaching and Learning Center here at Plymouth.
Great. Thanks, Robin. Heather, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Miceli. I'm an adjunct faculty member at 2 institutions in Rhode Island, Roger Williams University and Johnson & Wales University, although today I'm here talking about the work that I do at Roger Williams. I teach general education science courses in our core program, and yeah, I'm really excited to be here today.
Thanks, Heather. Happy to have you here. Jennifer, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Van Allen. I am an assistant professor of literacy education at Lehman College in the City University of New York. So I teach in the Bronx. I previously was a K-12 teacher, teaching 2nd grade, 4th grade, and then serving as a literacy coach in elementary school and at the district level. So lots and lots of teaching and teaching teachers about teaching.
Love it. Thanks, Jennifer. Okay, just to really, in case folks are on today's webinar who are just joining this conversation, I'm going to have 2 really quick slides to get us all on the same page. And in the email that we send with the recording, I'll be sure to include some additional resources if you want to learn more. So we're talking about open pedagogy today, but we need to start just defining open educational resources, so OER. So OER are teaching, learning, and research materials that reside either in the public domain or have been released under an open license that permits no-cost access, use, adaptation, and redistribution by others with no or limited restrictions. So these can be materials that we find on the web in digital format. They can also be in analog format. So you might see a textbook or some kind of handbook that is actually printed in analog format. And OER are broadly considered to meet Wiley's 5R frameworks. So that's the materials are able to be reused, revised, remixed, redistributed, and retained. And I love this Venn diagram because it's really helpful to understand. Sometimes it's tricky to understand the difference between a resource that is free to students and one that is OER. So it kind of fits the mold of it's free, but it also has that really crucial foundational license component that allows us to do so much more with the resource than we would be able to do with traditionally copyrighted material. So OER falls right in the middle of free and openly licensed. So today we're talking about open pedagogy and what does it look like in practice. And there are several different definitions in our field of what open pedagogy is. I like to focus on the idea that we're centering students in content creation and we're lending them, or we're ensuring that we give them agency in that process. There are several other definitions that I will be sure to include in the resource email that include works from DeRosa, Jangiani, Cronin, and Bali, and others. So what I have here is not fully inclusive, but I just wanted to give us a little taste of what it is. And this other piece at the bottom, this OER-enabled pedagogy, we're talking about students not only involved in content creation, but then what they do with that resource after. If they're sharing it with the public, sharing some kind of social object, we have to help scaffold that process of sharing content that is openly licensed and available to others. So again, lots of different definitions, but I don't want to spend too much time talking about definitions because this webinar is all about showing you what does this actually look like in practice. So I'm going to hand it over to my panelists, and they're going to start us off by each sharing a little bit about how they approach this work, what it looks like in their classroom, some successes they've had, challenges they may have had, and then we'll get into a few more pointed questions after that. So Robin, I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, to start us off. And if you need to screen share, you can let me know.
I do.
Okay, let me stop sharing.
Okay, let me get the right piece. All right. So I'm going to just take a little tour here of some stuff that I talk about a lot when I talk about open. And it's kind of funny because we sort of have this ubiquitous definition in academia of what a textbook is, right? You know, if somebody says math textbook or French textbook, we sort of know what they mean. And the crazy thing about open is when I say textbook now, it means like my default definition is just nothing like those previous default definitions that I used to use. And I just woke up one day and was like, my God, this changed like a really core basic thing about education for me. And I think it was about 2014 when I heard Cable Green from Creative Commons give a talk about the Creative Commons open license. And it blew my mind. I had never heard of Creative Commons or an open license, which is basically the little magic license that sits on top of copyright. So you retain your copyright, but you give people permission to share things. And as somebody who was a real advocate for public higher education and feeling really afraid about the rapid privatization of all things public, when I heard about the Creative Commons license, I thought, my God, this is going to be a thing that I can actually do in my classroom, in practice, to make visible my commitment to making knowledge more accessible to the public students that I teach at my public institution. So I was really jazzed up and excited about it. I was an English professor at the time. So if you teach English, you know, we're actually like pretty cheap in terms of books, right? So our students aren't generally paying $400 for a single textbook as they are in some fields. The other thing is, like, we're talking mostly about educational materials here, not about books, right? So my students still have to buy books sometimes. Like if I'm teaching a contemporary American poet, buy a book of poetry. Like, we're not opposed, right? There's terrible waste in academia where money is going out to horrible things. Buying a book of poetry is not a horrible thing. But what did seem horrible to me is that I was teaching early American literature, which is literature 1400 to 1800. And my students were paying like 69, somewhere between 69 used and like 85 new dollars for a collection of basically public domain American literature, right? All of the literature that was inside of it was out of copyright. And this seemed like a problem to me. It seemed like profiteering on the part of the textbook industry to be charging my students that much for work like that. So I put together a little team of undergraduates one summer, and we went out, now knowing what I knew about open licensing, and found public domain versions of the key texts that I was teaching in that early American literature class. And over the course of one summer, 10 of us, mostly undergrad students who were actually about to take the course, built this open anthology of earlier American literature. So we built it using Pressbooks, which is more or less a free tool. We have it at my institution, but even if you don't have it, you can use it more or less for free on the web. Sometimes you end up paying 25 bucks, depending on how you want to share your book, but it's more or less free software. If you don't know a lot about technology, it really doesn't matter. The way we built this is we found public domain versions of the text, we copied them, right, with our cursors, and then we pasted them into Pressbooks. So there's nothing super fancy about it. But you can look at the context here at the table of contents, and you can see, you know, if you click on one of the texts, you will find the openly licensed version. Now, it wasn't super simple to do this. We had to learn a little bit about copyright, because just because something was written in, you know, 1720 doesn't mean that that version of it is openly licensed, right? It might, or in the public domain. It could be highly edited. Maybe somebody's updated the spelling. So my students and I learned a little bit about copyright. It wasn't very scary. Our librarian helped us. And then we just built this anthology, and we came back in the fall and started to use it. And at the beginning, my students were so happy because the class was free. Who does not want it to be free? They could print it, or they could use it digitally. So that was great. And then that's when the whining and the complaining started, because what you'll see is, if you look at this requerimiento, you know, you just start reading, on behalf of the king, Don Ferdinando, and Donna Juana won his daughter, Queen of Castile and Leon. He was like, who are these people? What is this about? What is going on? In a regular textbook, there would be a little blurb here that would explain the context for students. There would probably be an image. There would probably be a map to show where these folks were. And there would be cultural examples of when they would read this text as a way of kind of the Spaniards staking their claim in the New World. So the students realized that this new book did not have a lot of what they expected out of an anthology. And that's when we got creative, and when the textbook really started to get exciting. So you can see here, for most sections at the beginning, there'll be the primary source, right? Here's Columbus, Journal of the First Voyage, Narrative of the Third Voyage. But at the beginning is the introduction, Hannah Hounsel. Hannah was a student in my class, and what she did is she signed up for Christopher Columbus, and a couple weeks before the class got to Columbus, she went in, did a research project, did a little introduction to Columbus, found some openly licensed maps about his voyage, and was able to explain it. Look, she even put some discussion questions there, which was a way that we could sort of get into a conversation. That's when we realized, hey, this is actually going to be pretty cool. Instead of writing stuff that is just going to go into Moodle or Canvas and die, you could put stuff in the textbook that your colleagues will actually read and appreciate. And that's when we really started having a lot of fun. People started doing other stuff. They started making videos. They started doing infographics. I layered a little app. I don't know if you can see it here because I got 7 billion things open in my screen. But normally, if you're looking at this book, I'm just going to see if I can get it to load. Okay, so we're going to look at Columbus here. You, I think, will see. No, you won't. I don't know why. But normally, in the sidebar, there is an app called Hypothesis that is loaded. I honestly don't know why it's not loading here. But what the app allows students to do is to annotate in the sidebar so that they can talk to each other about the reading. In the course of one semester with 18 students, they put about 10,000 annotations into this early American anthology, which was crazy. There's no way they were putting that kind of notation into their books before we went with this sort of homemade digital anthology. So the textbook really became kind of like a course community. People were in there, they were putting their work in there, they were trading ideas in there, they were having conversations. In the evaluations, many students said that our textbook was the best part of the class, which no student had ever said about the early American textbook before we started using this. And that was the only semester that I actually taught this course. But my colleague, Abby Good, took the course over the next semester, and she actually made a copy of my textbook, and she and her students kind of redid it, reorganized it, reframed it. They were looking particularly at agriculture in that class. So her book has a lot of notation and organization around sort of agriculture in the developing United States. So she was able to really take the collection in a different direction. And that's when we started realizing that people all over the country were starting to hear about this student created textbook that was a pretty serviceable replacement for the Heath anthology, the Norton anthology. So Tim Robbins is at Graceland University, and he made a copy of it. And this version was funded by Rebus Community. They had a grant from Hewlett. So there's about 20 academics now working on this version. It still uses stuff from my original students, from Abby's students, but it's got many, many more texts than we were able to get in there. And they've really, like, some of my students were working with stuff for the first time. They didn't always, they might have had a B entry rather than an A entry. So some of these editors went through and elevated everything so that it was really critically reviewed and peer reviewed. And that anthology should be out sometime very soon. And I think that will really replace all of the early American anthologies that exist on the academic publishing market. So the point for me was really, you don't have to do something amazing or perfect or incredibly scholarly in order to really make a contribution, because the open license will allow other people to come in and improve upon your work as long as you're willing to collaborate. I do this in all of my classes now. So in interdisciplinary studies, we've created a really large textbook focused on connected learning and interdisciplinary approaches to education. It has scholarly work that's openly licensed, but lots of student created work as well. I will put into the chat this piece here, which is a discussion that I have about all of these textbooks, what it means to do student-created open textbooks, how you develop course community with them. So if you're interested in looking at any of these examples or learning more about them, you can just read this one post. So as soon as I stop here, I will go ahead and put it in the chat so you can review it. That's my section, and I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A.
Thanks, Robin. I have a quick question that came in. So the question is about how kind of like quality control. So do you edit the introductory materials to make sure that everything is correct? And how are students graded on that contribution?
Okay, so there's multiple ways to do this. For example, in my interdisciplinary class, we created like a student editorial board. So everybody was creating work, not in the textbook, just actually on the web, but anyway, you could do it anywhere, like in papers. And then the editorial boards at the end of the semester split things up into groups, and they would look at, say, 5 different assignments focused on the history of disciplines. And they would choose the one that was best, and that one would get curated into the textbook. Then we would sometimes, the next semester, we would have people go back and re-edit the best ones so that they would actually get another peer-reviewed pass. In the early American book, we didn't do that. People were split up. So Hannah Hansel's Christopher Columbus came out really great, which is why I hired Hannah Hansel, and she now works for me. Some other ones didn't go as well. And, you know, we didn't worry about it because we were making it just for us. When other people started using it, I thought, ooh, that's interesting. So we just put a disclaimer at the front that said, this is student created. You know, the work is just our best effort. You may find some of these are really helpful, others you may want to redo. So that's what Tim's version is doing, is it's really vetting the work. So it's up to you how you do that. If you want a peer-reviewed open textbook, you can get them, right? You can go and get things that are created only by academics, they're peer-reviewed by academics, but that's a different project than what I have here. So most of the editorial work is done also by students, which means that occasionally there are things in there that aren't as great. All of the grading I did separately. So you know, you can't see any of the grading. And occasionally if something went really poorly, I would say to the student, hey, shall we take this out of the textbook? Do you really want your name on this, like on the open web? So it's a great way to have a conversation about why quality matters. It's not just to get the A, it's because this work is going into the world. So in general, I have found it nothing but helpful to the grading process to make the work more authentic. But I can talk more about that anytime. We also have a different kind of grading process in my program that spurred from all of this that I can talk more about if you're interested.
That's super helpful. Thanks, Robin. Heather, would you like to share with us a little bit about the work you and your students do?
Absolutely. Let me get it. Everybody can see it.
Yeah.
A little bit of background. I teach our Core 101 course at Roger Williams. And what that is we have a core interdisciplinary set of courses that our students take. They take 5 courses. One is science, one is politics, one is human behavior, one is aesthetics, and of course the 5th one always eludes me off the top of my head. But I teach the science, general education. So my class is full of students who would rather not be there. And I fully acknowledge it. It's always the first thing I say on day 1. I get it. You're here because they tell you have to be here. So I have a lot of students that, you know, they come into class with tons of different backgrounds. I have students that have like 3 or 4 AP classes under their belts, but AP doesn't include a lab, so they have to take our class. Or I have students that haven't taken science since maybe their freshman year of high school, or they had really horrible experiences. And so I've always tried to make my class accessible to my students. Science is sometimes a little daunting to students, so I like to give them a lot of choice. And I've always had a project where students could choose their topic, could spend the semester researching what aspects of that topic they really wanted to focus on. And at the end of the semester, we would have this wonderful poster presentation where instead of them standing in front of a PowerPoint presentation and droning on for 2 hours. We're all talking and laughing and having that two-way communication, and they kind of realize how their topics connect with each other. And I loved this. I've always loved it. I've done it for 7 years. But one of the most disheartening parts of it was after those presentations, there would always be food. I'd be cleaning up. I'd leave the room, turn off the light, and I'd walk out into the hallway, and all of their posters were sitting next to the garbage can. And I always got really upset because I was like, all of that knowledge, all of that time is literally just thrown away. I started thinking about it. I joined the Roger Williams OER Faculty Fellows program, which is run by Lindsay. She invited Rajiv Jangjiani to come talk to us. And if anybody knows Rajiv, you walk out of a session of his and you're inspired to the max. And in the middle of his session, he was talking about students creating content. And I was like, well, what if students wrote a textbook for other students in my class? Like, instead of having like a textbook, I've never had a textbook for this class, by the way. But what would it look like? And so 4 years later, we have the Core 101 Open Pedagogy project. This is a series of currently 10 different websites that cover a variety of topics that we talk about in Core 101. Core 101 is not you have to understand this part of biology, this part of geology, this part of chemistry, this part of physics. It's much more towards ways in which science interacts with society and the types of science that our students are going to encounter out in the world. So you can see we have topics from artificial intelligence to climate change, to vaccines, which has been a very popular topic the past couple of semesters. And we are actually working on our 11th website this semester. But the way these websites work is that students choose whatever topic they are interested in the first day of class. They work on these websites, and like Robin talked about, they create the content, but they're students, so it's not perfect. But instead of actually having scholars editing their websites, the next group of students just picks it up and works on it. So all of these websites are in various stages of completion. One of my favorite websites is our space exploration website. So I've had one group focus on exoplanets, and then the next group really focused on the exploration of Mars and why we want to go to Mars, and what kind of work we've done exploring on Mars. And so each of these websites has been edited by several sets of students. As you can see, some of our students, from all of these, I don't actually have the fall 2020 students up there yet, but it's this wonderful renewable resource that students can take from one semester to the next and see how their interests can just keep getting expanded upon. And if a website isn't that great, we leave it. We leave it and we say, guess what? That means there's enough work for the next semester to work on, and they can take that website and kind of amplify it. And they have full reign on these websites each semester to edit them. And so it's this wonderful project. We use Google Sites because we're a Google education school, so a lot of the collaboration is very easy. I'm thinking of maybe switching to Pressbooks in the next couple of years, but being able to give them a folder with the website editing system and their rough drafts and stuff like that is all in there. It's been very successful. My students talk about how confident they are when they're done writing these pages, because they never thought that they could A, find science interesting, but B, find science interesting enough that they could write a story, or they could write a website about it that other students are going to use later. And a lot of my students, when they write about what they're feeling at the end of the semester, they tie back to these websites and they're like, I actually feel like I've contributed something to something bigger. And so that is the Core 101 Pedagogy Project. So I'm happy to answer any questions during the Q&A for that.
Thank you, Heather. Beautiful sites. Okay, I am going to pass it off to Jennifer. If we could hear a little bit about your classroom and what you and your students do, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to share a document, which I will also share on the screen in the chat. So I first learned about open pedagogy through our library. So Stacy Katz, you might know her, one of our librarians, our OER librarian, held a workshop on open pedagogy. And as a teacher, I have a very constructivist teaching philosophy. I want my students to get their hands dirty and to dig in and apply content that we're learning. And so when I learned about this, I said, well, I didn't know about OER. I didn't know about open pedagogy. I want my students to know about it so that they can apply it in their own classrooms, because I'm working with teacher candidates and largely graduate level students who are already teaching in the classroom. So I said, I want to teach about OER in my technology course because it's a very natural fit, and B, get them involved in doing something with OER. So that's how this project came about. I already had an assignment in my language literacy and educational technology course in which students learned about best practices for teaching 21st century literacy skills to students, and they had to create a unit plan in which they used inquiry-based learning or project-based learning or problem-based learning to teach these skills, teach students how to conduct online research, to create infographics, to do something that improved their 21st century literacy skills. And so I took that project that they have to do and I opened it up using OER. And this is what resulted. Students, for the culminating assignment in the course, they were now invited to not create from scratch as they had to before, but they could go in, find OER that already existed, and either design their own, or they could adapt and remix what was already out there. And so in the course, when I teach them about OER, I use OER Commons, since OER Commons is a repository that has a ton of educational resources, but a majority of it is K-12. I use that as the main platform. And so introduced them to that, and then taught them about OER and invited them to now take something that they found when they were exploring this repository and adapt it to their own classroom, remix it with something that they have, or remix two materials together, or design their own. The only parameters were that they needed to support students' 21st century skills within this, because that was the whole point of the class, and make it fit for their classroom. And so with this project, I give them, they could be creative. They can create a module, an online learning module for their students, an open book chapter. It could be lesson plans or unit plans. It could be an inquiry unit. It could be a collection of resources with mini lessons on how and when to use them. Models of projects that they've completed along with students' attempts so they can use it in the future. I want it to be very usable for their own classroom. And I scored it based on a rubric with the project design and the students' skills that their students, the skills that they're nurturing with their own students, and then their own reflection on the project. So they have to create it and they have to implement it in their classroom. So they're invited to share it openly. I do request that we have a class folder that continues to be added to. They do have to share it within this class, but they don't have to share it openly unless they choose to. So in the last iteration of the course, which was the first iteration of this assignment, 3 students decided to share openly. I invite them to share it on OER Commons in a more public forum, but only one student took me up on that offer, and she created a unit plan on ocean garbage patches. So you can see she put it up on OER Commons, and it has the entire project, including rubrics that she created for students' oral presentations, quizzes that she used with students to review content knowledge. As you scroll down, there's a project overview. She talks about the technology that she incorporated with her students. She connects it to the Common Core state standards. In there, since we're in New York, they have to connect it to the New York State Learning Standards, but she realized that if I'm publishing this on the web for others to use, they may not be in New York. So she connected it to the larger Common Core state standards, and she incorporated all of her lessons. She even included links to presentations she used with her students that could be adapted. She sourced her images if they weren't open images. And she used all different kinds of materials. So I will put the link to this lesson in the chat if you want to check it out, if I can find the chat. Here it is. So I had other students who just decided to share theirs in this local class folder. And one of my students, which this is a course in literacy, but we talk about multimodality. And so she decided to create an OER book chapter for her families. So her problem she was experiencing in her classroom is that she would send math homework home with her students, and the parents are like, what is this newfangled math? I don't know how to do this. And so she wanted to support the parents in supporting her students in completing their homework at home. So she did an addition and subtraction, first grade mathematics book chapter. She connected it to the standards. But each of the chapters, if you will, incorporated multimodal aspects. So she had definitions. She incorporated links to YouTube videos that parents can go to learn more about how to do this math in action. She, very simple, I mean, this is for first grade. She incorporated visuals and practice problems. So here's we count forward, watch to learn more. And so she assigned specific chapters and pages for the students to read at night. And then when they came in the next day, she did practice activities with them, assuming they would have that knowledge. So she used a flipped classroom model. And the parents she got wide approval from the parents because they had some supports now to support their students at home. She ran into some challenges because not all students would do the readings with their families. So they were a little bit lost. But she found that those students who did were then serving as the teacher for those students who didn't. And so it was really a very popular project that she did. So creating this multimodal kind of book chapter for her students. Another student created a unit on looking at characters and Because of Winn-Dixie for 4th grade. And so this is what she shared openly. Her lesson plan, she has her unit plan. So she has the particular lessons within it and the materials and procedures. So this is all shared CC by SA, but then she also incorporated some worksheets or some handouts that she gave her students, recording sheets for thinking about questions you want to have answered about the characters. And then interview questions sheet. So helping her students, they actually served in this project, they served as the interviewer, and another student would serve as the character, and they asked each other questions about it. So these were the questions. It's taking forever to load. And then there's another sheet. I'm not sure why that's not loading quickly. And there's another sheet that actually came from Teachers Pay Teachers. Makes me sad, but she attributed it to the source that was incorporated with it. So they knew that they could go outside of it, but they were encouraged to ensure that all of the materials they were incorporating into their projects were openly licensed as well, so they could be adapted. And so with this project, there are lots and lots of challenges. They came in with zero knowledge of OER and Creative Commons licensing. And so wrapping their minds around it was really challenging for them. And one of the biggest barriers to more students not sharing openly. I also found that some of them didn't want to share openly because they were nervous. They were very nervous about their own competence. Most of them are beginning teachers with less than 5 years of experience. And so they didn't feel like they knew enough to share with the world. But after they implemented their projects, they then came back and said, well, you know, this actually turned out really well. I should have shared this with everyone. I'm like, why don't you? Well, now I forgot about it. I forgot about time. So that is definitely something that in rethinking this assignment and reiterating it again in the course, giving them more opportunity to apply it in their own classrooms and then adapt it for a public audience. But yeah, so there were definitely some challenges. There were some uncertainties on my part and the students' part. It became a little messy at times, but in the end, the students were super proud of what they shared with each other, or what they shared, what they created, and were found that they learned more from this project than they have in other projects. So successful overall. Yeah, so I'll be happy to answer any questions you guys have about that project.
Thanks, Jennifer. That was so cool to see. And as a parent of a kindergartner, like I will totally appreciate a parent resource like that, specifically for math homework. That's really neat. I love seeing all of these wonderfully student created resources. And I hope it's inspiring our audience to see what this might look like in their classrooms. And I know we spend a lot of time talking about how do we scaffold this for our students? How do we support them? This is so new. They're often just asked to, have that one-on-one transaction between them and the professor. They hand in work. But it's also very new for faculty. Like this can be super new. So Jennifer, I don't know if you have any advice for someone who's so used to being the sage on the stage to kind of handing that off to the students and having this be student led, because it can be really nerve-wracking, I think, for faculty.
Yeah, absolutely. And my biggest piece of advice is to embrace the messiness, because it can get quite messy with students saying, I don't know, there's too much choice here, but then valuing the choice later on. So that's the biggest piece of advice I have. Now, how do you even get to the messiness in the first place? I think it's about shifting your thinking. Instead of saying that, no, I need to tell them all I know about this topic, you're going to do that, but you're going to do it in a different way. You need to plan experiences for your students that help them to apply the content in some way, shape, or form. So in education, it only makes sense. Teachers need lots and lots of teaching resources and sharing of ideas. So in my discipline, it makes a lot of sense for them to create these teaching and learning resources and then share those with others. What's meaningful in your discipline? What is helpful for people who are practicing within that discipline, and apply those kinds of activities. Let students co-construct this knowledge together through activities where they're applying the content in meaningful ways for the discipline. And then stand back and watch. Give them room to mess up, to problem solve. And then when they're really struggling, step in, ask a question, give a piece of advice, or say, have you looked at this? That's how you're sharing your knowledge, which is why it gets a little bit messy. And it's not something that you can plan for 100%. You plan the experiences, you stand back, and then you scaffold, you support, you facilitate, which it gets messy, so start small. Don't plan this big old project. What are ways that you can shift things in small ways more towards something where the students are co-creating?
That's really helpful. And I know, Jennifer, you and Stacy published a wonderful chapter in Open Pedagogy Approaches. Maybe you could link that in the chat. I think that would be really helpful for folks to see your process and how you did that slowly. Great. So I know a lot of us are looking to leverage open pedagogy to kind of do this work more through a social justice lens. There are so many opportunities for us to take our disciplines and kind of help our students do this work. So Heather, I'm wondering if you could touch upon, I had a faculty member ask or say, I teach intro to bio. Some students go on to be biology majors, but it might be a gen ed requirement for them. What might be an example of a way to embrace that class or a renewable assignment through a social justice lens, something like biology, since you teach science?
Yeah, I found this very difficult myself when I first started teaching and knowing about anti-racist work and trying to teach through a social justice lens, because science is so straightforward, or at least we think it is so straightforward, and there's facts that you have to know to walk out of the classroom and be a successful biologist. And the way that I've approached it in this project and in my classroom is it really is very much student-led. I start out, I have a disclaimer on my syllabus that science falls under the same oppressive systems that any other system does. It is a very white male dominated field. And the goal of this class is to not only give you facts about science, but also to identify ways in which oppression has occurred in science. And but at the same time, I give readings, but I don't necessarily require us to have a discussion about it. So it is very much student-led. I have several places in the project where students have identified that this is a topic that needs to be addressed. This is a social justice topic that needs to be addressed. So like my vaccine page has an entire set of pages about inequities in vaccination rates and why that occurs. And it's because of healthcare coverage, and it's because of location, and it's because of medical racism and those kinds of things. So the way I approached it early on is I would kind of dip my toe in. The easiest place I always found was when we were talking about DNA and talking about chromosomes and the XX and XY, and starting to talk about what it means to be transgender. And even just saying, I'm going to talk about XX and XY today, but just because someone has XX and somebody has XY doesn't necessarily mean that it's XX is female, XY is male. That's not how it works. And just kind of letting it sit there. But over time, it's gotten to the point now I have more confidence. And that's kind of what I was reluctant about. I didn't feel like I had the expertise to have those conversations. But the students, especially our students today, they're very interested in knowing how to do this. But a good way that you can also incorporate it into open pedagogy is to make sure that the authors that your students are citing are women, are minoritized populations, are indigenous, are, are LGBTQ. And then that way they see that those identities are doing the work. They're doing good things in the field. And a lot of that work comes with a social justice lens as well. So that's kind of my advice. But start small. You don't have to jump in and do it all, because I still don't do it all. And let the students kind of guide you through what they're comfortable with.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Heather. Robin, I'm wondering, since you showed us that incredible anthology, I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for faculty who might be teaching, a similar course that is, tends to focus on the traditional Western canon, like any advice for diversifying that and having students lead that process and what that might look like.
Sure. I mean, I think for me, so much about what Open Ped has given to my students is a sense that the work is authentic rather than hoop jumping. And I think with diversity work, this becomes really important, because so much of the way that we do diversity and inclusion in the institutions is this sort of checkbox yeah, you met the diversity requirement, or like, look, I diversified. And this can have a really negative effect, I think, on how we think about the importance of diversity in our work. So to counteract that sense of like, look, we have to get some quota of people of color into the syllabus, I think instead, there's two ways you might think of approaching it from a more student-centered perspective. The first is to think about the diversity that you have in your class. If students are to look at their own heritage, for example, if they're to look at some of the challenges that their families have perhaps faced, if they can start by asking some of the questions about the gaps and silences that they're aware of from their own experience. So there's really great examples of people who teach in really diverse institutions, starting by asking their students, who's not included here? How are you reflected or not reflected in this anthology? What kind of work would we need to do to find those voices? If you teach at a place that's less diverse, first of all, it's interesting to call attention to that lack of diversity and how the lack of diversity in your own classroom matches the lack of diversity in an anthology that you might be using. So that's one way to start. But I think another way is also to work backwards. So for example, when we're reading in my early American Lit, the canonical, Thomas Jefferson pieces or whatever, Thomas Jefferson, of course, is talking about race all the time in really problematic ways. So one of the questions that can be provoked is, okay, if this is how Thomas Jefferson is sort of classifying how we racialize Black people during this period, would we hear the same thing if we read Black people from this period? Why don't we read them? Why is it difficult to find the texts? Well, let's look, at how Jefferson is talking about, how their daily lives are set up and figure out, how that contributes to invisibility. So it's not really just the task of finding the text and bringing it forward. It's involving students in the critique. And I think in order to do that, and somebody asked this, I think in the chat somewhere, or I saw somewhere, like if students are resistant to doing that work, especially white students, you're really going to meet that resistance if you just force it and you say, okay, we have to do diversity, so here we go. I think instead you have to get them to recognize the gaps, to recognize the textual violence, to recognize the silences, and then to take responsibility for doing the work to find those things. There are tons of archives out there that focus specifically on silenced voices, historically. So even just providing some of those databases and a small assignment saying, what do you notice, when you read this stuff, can get students feeling some ownership over, hey, this is a real problem, for only looking at one kind of voice in this class. So anything you can do to put students in the driver's seat for asking the questions, not just finding the answers, I think that's when you'll have better results.
Super helpful. Thanks, Robin. I know some folks have asked in the chat about places to look for examples of student-led content. So I don't know if anyone wants to touch on that or even screen share anything quickly. We have about 4 minutes left. I know, Robin, you and Rajiv run the Open Pedagogy Notebook, which has some really awesome stuff. Heather and Jennifer, I don't know if you have any other recommendations for folks if they really just want to see what this looks like in practice. Sometimes it's easier to connect with just an individual. So, you could reach out to your librarian and say, I'm interested in doing this. I just don't, I want to see more examples. I want to know what it could look like in my classroom. I think it's easier for faculty to connect with other faculty. But definitely, recommend reaching out to whomever on your campus, maybe either working in this space or can connect you to someone on another campus if it's not happening there. And I see Robin just put the Open Pedagogy Notebook in the chat. Perfect. Yeah, and OER Commons is a good place to look. let's see.
I was also going to suggest some of the best places that I've found is, like the Open Ed Conference, OER. I can't think of the one in the UK that just happened or is happening. OER Domains, OE Global. But Open Ed is really, like, I think one of the most faculty friendly ones. Like, if you want to get ideas for what people are doing with open education and open pedagogy, just sign up and go to a couple of sessions, because there's something for everyone.
For sure. Yeah, I think I've definitely found Open Ed is super friendly for practitioners. They have lots of different levels of, if you're just joining this conversation, you can learn, the basics, all the way to, how do we actually do this, workshops on scaffolding, supporting students through this. Yeah, and Twitter. I have learned so much on Twitter. I only use Twitter really for this space, and it's super helpful to connecting me to faculty who are doing this work. We have 2 minutes left. I'm going to open it up to my panelists. If you have any final words of wisdom for our attendees, advice, anything. I think the big takeaways I heard from you all was start small. You don't have to, take on a large project that can be extremely overwhelming. So just start small and really have your students kind of guide this process and help lead you. Robin, I see you're unmuted. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I was just going to add the little tagline that I always keep in my head that helps me make sense of a kind of complicated jumble of stuff, which is, if OER is about increasing access to knowledge, open pedagogy is about increasing access to knowledge creation. And I think that jibes pretty well with a lot of us who don't just want our students to absorb content like consumers. And it's really important in a broken labor market that we not just devolve into training students by giving them bits of knowledge, but instead we help them feel more comfortable shaping the knowledge and really sort of realizing that they have some autonomy to affect and transform the world. So just thinking about increasing access to knowledge and increasing access to knowledge creation has really made me come alive, I think, in the classroom mid-career when I really needed a boost. So it's been great.
I love that. And me as a librarian full-time, I look at it when I talk to students, I really like to open their eyes to information privilege and what that means, who has access to information, and how they can help break down that barrier. So by openly licensing their work and contributing to the commons, they are helping break down that information privilege barrier. Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. It was lovely. Thank you to our panelists. And just as a reminder, anyone who registered will get an email in about a week's time with a link to this recording and the Q&A and any resources that were talked about today. So thanks for joining, and everyone have a lovely day. Bye.